I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation from whose lands this event is being broadcast today, and pay my respects to their elders and storytellers, past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands you're joining us from today. Feel free to make your own acknowledgement of country in the chat box if you'd like to do so. So our guest today is David Stavanger. David is an artistic director of Red Room Poetry, and he manages their Poetry Month. He was previously the co-director of the Queensland Poetry Festival and part of the programming team at Woodford Folk Festival. He's also known for his work as the producer of Mad Poetry, a project for writers with lived mental health experience. In terms of his own practice, David is a poet and editor living on Dharawal land. His first full-length poetry collection, The Special, was published in 2014 and awarded several prizes. The follow-up, Case Notes, won the 2021 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Poetry. David is the co-editor of Solid Air, collected Australian and New Zealand spoken word, and Admissions, Voices Within Mental Health. His latest collection is The Drop-Off, which was published by Upswell yesterday, I believe. Welcome, David.
Hey, Sophie. Yes, it's very much release and launch week. It's good to be here, and I also just want to acknowledge I'm coming in from Dharawal, Wadi land in beautiful Port Kembla, just 10 minutes south of Wollongong.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, it was great to have you. Thank you for spending the time with us today. We will get on to some burning questions about the poetry landscape in a moment, but I thought first we'd love to know, how did you personally get into poetry?
I had a few entry points. There wasn't a lot of poetry collections in my house growing up, but one of the ones that was there were two books actually by Yevgeny Yevtushenko, the Russian poet, and the collected works in that, particularly a poem called Waiting, and another one that he wrote about being a dancer while watching basically, teens marry for one night and then go off to war, and he would dance at their weddings. That work really struck a chord with me. And later on, I saw live footage of him performing, and it was really kind of visceral and declarative, and I was like, wow, so I can work like this on the page and this outside of that context. And then at uni I was studying psychology and communications double, and I came across a documentary anthology series called The United States of Poetry, put together by an amazing New York poet, Bob Holman, which really expanded the whole frame of who can write poetry, the intersection of poetry and hip hop and song, and the whole performance poetry traditions out of the state. So they're probably my two big ways into the form.
And obviously you're a widely published poet yourself. Can you share a little bit about your practice?
I have a very loose practice because I'm a poet who's also, one of my mentors was the New York performance artist and poet who does a lot of multi-voice work called Emily XYZ. And she said to me very early on, it's important to be a servant to your form. And I've always believed in that part of my practice is actually to create platforms for poetry, for other poets to produce it to. So that's been as much as my practice as anything else. And as it's led to then a career, which I never really sought, but has sort of landed that way, being a producer and artistic director. My own writing practice has had to sort of be wedged in the mornings at the side, which I don't mind, because I think it's really important to have artists in artistic leadership roles and shaping these sort of spaces and pushing back at some of the things we're actually seeing in the industry right now. So yeah, I put a book out every 5 years. I'll do a little prompt, a little
Yes, great.
promotion. The Drop-Off just came out through Upswell Publishing this week. So yeah, I'm a big advocate that it's okay to have your own practice and also work within that practice. They don't have to be separate things. There has to be boundaries. But yeah, I write sometimes in the mornings. Fragments come to me when I'm driving. Luckily, I work with a form that's okay.
Yeah. So Red Room, which you've referenced there, it's been around for over 20 years now, which is amazing for, I mean, it's amazing for any kind of arts organization and, any organization in the literature sector in particular. So that's worth noting. Can you tell us a bit about how the organization came to be?
Yeah, it's an incredible history. I've been working at Red Room for 5 years,
Mhm.
but my history with Red Room goes back way longer. So it started out as the Red Room, a community radio poetry show by Joanna Featherstone, herself a poet. In fact, my first publication was on one of their early CDs.
Oh, wow.
They came out in CD format. So
Yeah.
actually, my first published poem was an audio poem with the Red Room. And then they formed into Red Room Poetry with a focus on, I suppose, more bespoke poetry projects, trying to put poetry into interesting places in interesting ways, tying poems to pigeons on pillows in hotels, back of toilet doors, really great, innovative activations. And then under Dr. Tamara Bennett, the last director, there was those sort of work still existed, but there was a move towards greater amplification of poetry, but also intersecting with more a social justice kind of focus. So poetry in first languages was developed in consultation with the poet Lorna Munro, and then Curly Saunders came on board with that. Going in the Unlocked program, going into juvenile detention centers, and which I was involved with some of that, and prisons. And then I was brought on 5 years ago to try and help set up a National Poetry Month,
Mhm.
establish a platform as a national consciousness and an initiative like they see in the States. So we're about to enter our 5th year of that as well. And yeah, we celebrated 20 years 2 years ago, and we put out an anthology, A Line in the Sand, which I helped edit with Tamarin, to celebrate that as well.
Right. So tell us more about National Poetry Month, because I kind of feel like, although it is quite new, it feels now like we've always had it. Like it's just such, it feels like it has so quickly been embedded. Is that how it feels from your perspective?
It just feels like a lot of work. It was a
Fair
mammoth
enough.
it was a mammoth project, and it's starting to really pay off for sure. Like it's entering, like I said, its 5th year. We started it while we're still in that sort of like hybrid mode of some lockdowns in the first year, but then it's really sort of grown nationally with incredible interstate partnerships. It has real national reach. It engages poets across. It's in terms of representation of form, voices, but also geography. It does something I think few platforms can. Both in terms of it's not a festival, but it has a lot of live events, because the reading of poetry live is so important. It's such an important part if you want to talk about poetry landscape, not
Mm.
just to hear it, but in order to have people engage with your work and potentially buy books beyond the text. And writing poetry can be quite a intimate thing you do alone, but community is at the heart of poetry too. So live events, daily commissions, prompt competition, a lot of online free, accessible or low cost workshops. And then last year, what really kind of threw it to the next level was we've been partnering with the ABC, who had been platforming more and more poets for us, but BBC came on with our new CEO, John T. Claypole, who used to work at the BBC. We did a international broadcast partnership, and Contain Strong Language, which is a spoken word festival of the BBC, came outside the UK for the first time to Sydney, and resulted in a multi-venue festival really around Sydney, and ended up with 6 broadcast sessions on the BBC, and a listening audience of 5 million people heard some of our most exciting spoken word artists and voices from Western Sydney, and also commissioned 5 radio essays. So I think internationally, Poetry Month is getting known beyond these shores too.
Yeah, yeah. So much work, I'm sure, but that must feel amazing.
Oh, look, it does. Like to work at an organization. I mean, we have 3 really kind of spine programs. One is Poetry Month, which is really about amplifying the form opportunities, getting poetry beyond poets. That's really important. Poetry for poets, absolutely, but also how do we get beyond the audiences that are already engaged?
Mm.
And then Poem Forest, which is our like, I was real passionate, Tamara and Bennett's, and all of us, is the intersection of the environment and poetry, where students can write a poem and a tree is planted in response to that. And that's come under our First Nations team this year, their stewardship, and it's going to really. I'm really excited by the way that's connecting itself back to land as well, and whose land we're on. And within that poetry in first languages sort of stream, we also have Bri Bray, this song, the Whale Song Project, which was piloted last year, but it follows the song lines of the whale on the East Coast with different communities. And that's one of the projects which I think, yeah. So there's other projects too, like Mad Poetry you mentioned, but those three tenets are so central to why it's so good to work for an org like Red Room.
Yeah. Okay. I will pick back up on the question or, topic of sort of, multimedia sort of publishing and performance of poetry in a sec. But just to give us some context, like whenever I hear about the work of Red Room and, I see Jonty around, and it feels like there must be 100 people working there. Like there's so much being done. Is it actually a big team, or are you guys just, working every hour of the day and night?
um, I think that's a question you could ask of any small to medium arts work I was talking to you earlier about. I think that everybody in small to medium arts, and particularly in literature, is over delivering, which is great. On the one hand, we should really celebrate it. On the other hand, expectations when you're a small to medium org just grow the more you deliver. It doesn't go the other way. But we have an amazing team. One thing to really sort of foreground is that most of the team members in Red Room are practicing poets who also have other skill sets. Like Rani, who's our marketing comms, is also an amazing poet, and Izzy Roberts Orr, who produces with me Poetry Month, is an amazing poet, and Nicole Smead, my co-artistic director, who's artistic director of First Nations, incredible musician, sound artist, poet. Luke Patterson, a First Nations poet. It goes on and on. Claire Albrecht, who was the editor of the Suburban Review until recently and does our operations. I think that's really unusual to have that kind of skill set across the team. So that gives us a lot of flexibility and a lot of connections into the kind of sector in different ways and an understanding of what maybe artists need. Our team is growing, like we're currently bringing on a learning producer because there's more and more demand for learning resources, and how do we foreground that engage students when we're seeing in education pulling away from poetry maybe as a form. But yeah, I think we managed to deliver an incredible amount given the size of the team, and self-care has become a real focus this year at Red Room. And we can't deliver lived experience mental health projects if we're not taking care of the team in that space. So yeah, I think we strike a balance. We border on burnout, and then we pull through it collectively, and then we sort of really reflect on what's the best way forward and do we need extra staff. But it's budgetary too, as you would know. So we work within given the scope of what we deliver, the budgets aren't that huge.
Yeah, it's a daily challenge, I think, when we have teams who are so passionate and are part of this community themselves, and like really want to come in and deliver, and how much can actually be done within the workday is the question, because there will always be more ideas and more ambition than we can actually get through. So it's a challenge. So back onto publication in its various kind of formats, always a great celebration when someone has a poetry collection published in the traditional way. But these days, as you've said, like your first publication was on a CD, for example, and there's digital, performance, etc. What can you tell us about the poetry kind of landscape in terms of publication at the moment? And, big question, so feel free to attack any part of it you like, but are there some parts of that that are really growing?
The poetry landscape, I hear this term a lot. I don't even know the kind of parameters of it. I don't think it's been fully mapped, to be really honest. It's a bit like a weird multiverse in a way. Yeah, I think contemporary poetry landscape in Australia, traditional publishers, I think we're seeing with some poets, we're seeing the kind of sales and spotlight on poetry we haven't seen for many years, and particularly on women and non-binary poets and queer poets and First Nation poets and poets out of Western Sydney. So that's really opening up the landscape. And I know some people feel, some poets have been around a while, sometimes feels like, oh, how do I sort of be part of this new landscape? I just think it's so exciting. I think it just opens it up for all of us, and it pushes all our work into sort of, look at what poetry can be when it fully embraces all the voices. So that's the first thing I'd say. I think it's the amount of voices that are being published and foregrounded is so different from when I started into poetry, maybe, I don't want to say it, like 18 years ago. But the other thing is, yeah, I think the small presses though, and I'm with a smaller press now in Upswell, it's a really hard time. They're not able to maybe put out the amount of books that they did, distribution and cost of postage. I think a lot of small presses, not just the poetry, it's a really difficult business model right now. And all credit to those sort of one person passion operators who are so key to that kind of poetry publishing ecology. I think in terms of performance, the Australian Poetry Slam is still going strong. Bankstown Poetry Slam, I mean, I went to one of theirs last year. They pulled like 6,000 people at the town hall. That is really at the heart of, that tells you there's an audience for poetry and they're really clear about the way they want to engage with it. We're seeing, with the kind of publication we do, and we're very fortunate to have the flexibility of being a commissioning org, which gives us the ability to thematically commission or match poets to particular projects meaningfully and create work that can resonate and connect with audiences beyond maybe traditional readers. And also we use things like poetry ambassadors, public figures that are maybe poetry adjacent or have a passion. One of the things that really resonates is when we like commission comedians who love poetry. I think there are through lines that tell you there's a hunger for poetry in different spaces and written maybe outside of traditional lanes, while there's still so much passion and desire for experimental, avant-garde, found cut up poetry on the page, which I love. I think the best way to be with the landscape at the moment is to sort of to be open to all of it. To be open to all of it. I think if you narrow your definition of what poetry is, you're not going to enjoy what's on offer right now as much.
Yeah. And while we're on the really big questions, what role do you see poetry as having in responding to the polarized state of the world at the moment?
Big question.
Mm.
I think it's as central as any other art form. I think that freedom of expression is under threat right now. I think poetry is an immediate form, and I think it can respond to things like, an active genocide, and I'm very comfortable to frame it that way, personally. In Palestine, it's able to respond to, the mediocrity of the political class, increasingly that we're seeing globally. It's able to respond to what's happening in the environment and the disregard there. And I think when you see things like, what's happened at like Q Music with an instrumental called River to the Sea, causing funding to be pulled, or what's happened with Khalid Sabsabi, there's real concern amongst poets. And they should be concerned about, it's only a matter of time before it's applied to the writing genre in all its forms. And in a year we're looking at to select a potential poet laureate under who knows what government. I think really standing by, and Red Room does really, we have a statement around this developed, the freedom of expression without political intervention, to respond to the world and their own and someone's own lived experience on their terms. Orgs really have to back that now more than ever. I think otherwise, if we don't stand up in this environment, and poets really are leading that. A lot of our poets like Omar, Segar, Evelyn Araluen and Overland, they're right at the front line of responding to, really critical things in the world right now through their writing and through their adjacent practice and the different roles they have.
And so in terms of the kind of, the responsibility that Red Room has in commissioning work, like I get the email every Friday and, receive this amazing poem. And so often it is something that feels like it is speaking to like this moment,
Yeah.
like I don't know if that is just some kind of incredible synchronicity, or I'd love to just hear a little bit about, how that commissioning process works, and, anything you can share about the kind of curating of that, because it does seem so kind of timely and relevant.
Yeah, there's many levels to our kind of commissioning process, and then what happens to the work we commission. So, our commissioning process. One thing I would say, there are way too many poets and artists compared to the level we'd want to commission. I mean, I think we're up to now commissioning something like around across projects, maybe 60 to 80 new pieces of work each year, but that doesn't even really put a dent in, how many people are writing right now. Um, so we commission across projects. Generally, it's the project lead. If it's a First Nations project, it's First Nations led, it's First Nation shaped and First Nation curated. And even if we are, like someone like myself, working on a project and engaging with a First Nations artist, where it's very deeply consultative across the AD and creative producing team. We are trying to commission a variety of representative voices in a project. That's really important, and that geographic reach is really important. And then relationship to communities in some projects are really important, like Bria Beret. It's going to depend on, if it's relating to Bundjalung country, it's really important. It's a Bundjalung poet and that community is engaged. Or Mad Poetry is about institutionalized lived experience to a large degree. So being aware of, people who are underrepresented in that space or don't often get platformed in a lot of traditional poetry journals, maybe writing about these sort of things, seeking those voices out. So there's a lot of collaboration with partners as well, getting voices put forward, talking about, who would work for a particular project. If there's an FRASTA commission with a major gallery, talking about the work there. So there's a lot of work goes into thinking behind the commissions, and very collaborative before we even sort of get to a commissioning stage a lot of the time. And then we commission a piece, a poem, we commission a reflection on what poetry means to somebody, and we commission, particularly for Poetry Month, a writing prompt. And those three pieces give us a lot of flexibility. We also do audio and video recordings. So we can work with different partners or different ways to put the work out into different digital spaces. And then someone like Rani, our marketing comms, will then curate a Friday poem from what is a massive archive of work. Like, we have one of the biggest poetry archives in Australia, including a massive amount of student poems. So how do we best repeat use this work rather than that? I think that's a real question for a lot of orgs, is you're generating this work, or you're inviting these submissions, or you're commissioning this work. How do we make sure its shelf life, it goes beyond that one moment of release?
Yeah. So on the topic of poets having like a kind of bigger career, and looking for opportunities out there, what advice would you have for people who are wanting to move from just writing traditional poetry to also having a performance aspect to their career?
I think it's such an individual thing. Like, you can't, if you're not drawn to performance, and often a lot of poets write performance. And I started out as a performance poet, doing kind of cabaret rock and roll stuff, and very much seeing the lines as a text, a performance text, which I think a lot of performance poets see it that way, that was never intended for the page. Then there are performance poets or poets whose working naturally in both mediums, or they have a version of it live and they have a version that they then adapt onto the page, because they're very different mediums. I think that's something that some poets from both spaces, and there's no real divide there. It's a theatrical divide often. I love the whole continuum. A lot of people really do. I think it's deciding, does your work in both those spaces? Is there a need to put it into both those spaces? I mean, the idea of putting a book out is still very important. It's a document, it's an object, but it's not everything. It's not everything. There are amazing, poets like, Luca Lesson, for example, performance poet, Greek Australian performance poet, who does put out self-published books, but then also puts out incredible videos and theatre shows. That's equally valid and important and of literary value as having a collection out. So I do think sometimes though, if you're a poet that wants to be engaged for like significant live events, understanding how to read your work is important. Like, and most poets do, but at the same time, spend some time inhabiting that particular poem, just then assuming you read every poem the same way. What is the voice of that poem? How do I get inside that poem? What happens into a live context where there's an exchange with an audience? I think all that, but you don't have to be like big and performative. Some of the best performers I've seen just know how to get inside their poem and read it.
And what about stepping into social media? Like, how can a poet, should a poet be thinking of those same kind of considerations? Like, would there be like a different version of a poem for social media?
Look, personally, taking off my Red Room AD hat, I'd love to get off all social media at the moment, more than ever. And I know a lot
Yeah.
of poets feel that way.
Yeah.
But it is a really useful tool. Like, I mean, I think it's really individual to the poet. I would say that I'm not a big fan of the idea of a poet having a brand personally. I think, or the idea that you have to present a certain way on social media as a poet. I think authenticity, whatever that actually is, in writing and an artist does matter. People can read that. So I think thinking about, you want to curate to a degree, maybe who you are in that space, but you want to sort of stick to the essence of what's in your work on the page or stage anyway. I think short excerpts, using Canva and things like that, which we use a lot, and I use as an artist to promote like the work, is really effective and has cut through. Like even at Red Room, it doesn't really matter in a lot of ways if somebody who's not encountered poetry goes on to read the whole poem that's linked there. The fact they've read 4 lines and felt something in a time where people are having to consume and there's so much online noise, is great. So, and I think like, yeah, short reading clips can be really effective. Some poets have used TikTok really effectively, but I think the idea of like the Instagram poet and that kind of viral success we saw with like Patricia Lockwood or um, name escapes me, New Zealand poet. Anyway, that time is sort of, I think, a bit over though. I don't think people frame themselves as even Instagram poets anymore. In fact, some of those poets, when we worked with them, said, please don't refer to me that way. I'm a poet. And I think that also tells us that that was like yeah, the hierarchy of poetry has broken down a bit, which is great. If your poetry's on Instagram and you've got people reading it, that's as valid as if you've got a book out with UQP or you've got like a theatre show at the Adelaide Cabaret Festival spoken word. Like we're all just poets. So I think use those platforms if they feel most natural to you and don't try to over curate your brand. Stick to, short things that reflect who you are.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful. Like the kind of democratization of this process is wonderful. And, people having the opportunity to, have their voices heard in all of these different places is really freeing. If you were starting your career again now, are there any things that you would do differently? Like, would you approach your poetry writing or, the business of being a poet differently at all?
Um, Business of being a poet.
Which I know sounds terrible, but this is,
Yeah, 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 yeah,
stuff
yeah,
that
yeah.
these
No,
sort
no,
of
it's not,
questions about, right?
it's not terrible. It's more just about, going back to then, like when I got into poetry, sorry, there's some dogs howling next door. Um, yeah, when I got into poetry, I kind of fell into it as a way to kind of cope with some things I was going through.
Mm,
And I think people often enter poetry as they're not thinking about it as a career or a business. I think a lot of poets are sort of either, and it's a throwaway term, but they do feel sort of drawn or called to it, or it's a necessary way to respond to what's happening in the world around them or within themselves. And then some poets obviously, study through courses and it's something they're sort of passionate about. I would say in terms of the business of poetry, it still comes down to those fundamental things of going to a lot of open mics, reading your work, reading a lot of different poets, being really open to robust, real feedback.
Mhm.
Being clear about what your ambition is. Like, are you trying to make money or get a publication history with journals? What's your relationship with rejection like? You know, like if it's not good in poetry, you're going to face, you know, a poetry journal might publish 25 pieces and they're receiving over 1,000. The demand for spaces is smaller. We're seeing less poetry, in my point of view. I've seen less poetry programs at poetry writing festivals more broadly and more specifically than I've seen in the past. We've seen the disappearance of a number of important poetry festivals in the last 5 years, including Queensland Poetry Festival, which was Arts Queensland funded, and now it's been rolled under Writers Queensland and doesn't exist as a festival anymore. So I think the business of poetry requires a lot of tenacity and a long game view of like, I want to build up a body of work. I'm open to rejection. It's not just financially based. I'm willing to have another side hustle or practice. And I'm willing to view poetry as a form that I can deliver in a number of different modes, whether that be, you know, I think those that are really working as a business are able to, you know, collaborate with other artists or musicians, um, build up a body of work and develop a meaningful relationship with a publisher. And also then doing, you know, the whole kind of schools workshop circuit or you know, the professional sort of engagement side of things. But I just think you have to have, you know, I feel like I have a lot of tenacity and willingness to be realistic about, you know, what poetry is going to give me. I mean, I still rent, so there you go.
Yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, that's really helpful. And, you know, that kind of sense of the scope of the issue, I think, is helpful in that, you know, when people get rejections, this is very much not personal. This is like 95% of people who applied for a particular thing got a rejection, right? Like, you know, depressing, but also depersonalizes it a bit, I think.
I think it's like, I think the more your career evolves with time as a writer, the more rejection you actually, in most cases, are grateful for it. Occasionally, like, oh, damn, you know, I've never been in that journal before. And, you know,
Mm.
that would have meant a lot. But often you revisit the poem, and I would say in 80% of those pieces, you think, this is undercooked.
Mhm.
There's a good reason this was pushed back on. Be grateful for that. And then go back and work on that piece. And it's also, in other cases, I've got a couple of poems that are in this book, which I know are as good, if not better, than some of the pieces that were published in, you know, the Meanjins and Westerlies and those sort of places, because, you know, it just didn't resonate, or it sits outside maybe what those particular journals are looking for. So just having that a bigger picture awareness, and but then taking the gratitude to develop your work further sometimes, I think is really important.
We will go to audience questions shortly, but before we do, I wanted to ask you another thorny one, which you know, is something that we sometimes are asked here. What kinds of questions, David, do you think a poet can ask themselves to decide if a story is theirs to tell?
I mean, that's a really huge question. I'm probably
Mm.
not going to unpack that. Oh, I said unpack. I can't stand that phrase. I'm not going to fully kind of get into that.
Are there any things that you personally would think about, just in terms of, you know, not answering the questions, but just even the kinds of questions you would
I
ask?
think, yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to ask why there is a need to. First of all, the I in poem is what is the I if it's first person in the poem for you? If you believe that's some form of truth telling and some sort of reliable narrator, and you're inhabiting the voice or point of view from a particular marginalized or underrepresented voice, that increasingly can write to those experiences directly themselves. Why is there a need to do that? And is any part of you kind of furtive about that writing and, you know, avoiding consultation, but also trying to, part of you trying to self interrogate, you trying to avoid any questioning around that and really interrogate the need to take that up in the first place. I mean, I think, something like Overland has a really great editorial clear submission policy asking, do you identify as this particular group? Because we won't accept your work essentially if you're writing in that voice and you're not. And I think that's really important because, even in the last 5 years, I've seen poems in competitions written from, say, a First Nations point of view, and it's not a First Nations poet. That should be flagged. Um, I mean, at Red Room, we're very fortunate that we're commissioning dealing with the artists directly. But I think when people submit, in most cases, when people submit work, there has to be some sort of like process to sort of look at that. But the onus is ultimately on the poet to really self-interrogate this sense of entitlement or right to write from any perspective at the expense of others. That's my personal take on it.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. So a few questions here. So a question from Cedar, who I think has joined us.
Cedar. Hi, Cedar.
So Cedar has asked two things. Firstly, what's the pathway to being commissioned by Red Room Poetry and published online by them?
Yeah. Well, anyone can send an expression of interest, but we get a lot. And also, like I said, our commissioning it's not like a submission to a journal. Like we're also commissioning very specifically with partners or for particular projects. But we do consider those and do take people from the expression of interest. We look at that at the start of each year. But particularly for emerging voices, there's a number of pathways or calls to action that are participatory for anybody. Like we have the 30 and 30 competition across Poetry Month where people can enter fragments, lines, in response to our daily prompts. And at the end of August, we commission 3 of those voices for a full paid commission. We have our Red Room Poetry Fellowship, which we've expanded, which was one fellow, which was very prestige, but we felt a need to expand that. And at Verona, it's now 5, including 2 emerging voices that haven't been commissioned by us before. And those poets are then commissioned as well. We have the Phone a Poem project, which is a new project where we piloted it through Izzy Roberts-Orr, who produces that. It was a call out this time specifically to regional Victorian writers to write a poem that had some sort of relationship with that area, and it was just a general call out. And then we commissioned 10 poets who are then put on this poem phone, which you can then listen to at things like Melbourne Writers Festival. So we're always looking at there is that expression of interest mechanism, but also looking at participatory call outs as well across different projects. And we have another big one we're working on with the ABC at the moment. I didn't mention that before, actually. We've just entered a partnership with the ABC. One of our big remits this year is to get poetry back on the air of the national broadcaster because we had a really good relationship and they're really loving Poetry Month, the work we're doing, and we've developed this really good relationship. So as of 5 weeks ago, we started line breaks. So on a Wednesday at 10 to 1 on Radio National, a poet reads a poem live every week. And we're paying them for that reading and facilitating those recordings. So yeah, we're always looking at ways to engage more poets and have call outs where anybody, whatever level they're at, can engage with.
That's great. And that was 10 to 1 on Wednesdays on Radio National.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. It's just started. It'll be ongoing. Yeah.
Great. So Cedar's second question was, Cedar is a regular at the Mad Poetry Month workshops. Are there any publishers who you'd recommend for submitting a poetry manuscript on mental health and memoir themes in the current landscape?
That's a really good question, Cedar. And like, so Mad Poetry is an initiative that came out of the kind of Mad Pride reclaiming institutional language movement in the UK, and then started down here in the Illawarra. And I was sort of part of that collective with a number of other local poets, in particular Tim Heffernan down here. And then I brought it over to Red Room to give it a home and pay poets, lived experience poets, to facilitate it, be commissioned. And we do monthly workshops in partnership with Wellways, which are free and anybody can come in from anywhere. It's a real struggle finding a clear answer to that, Cedar, in terms of clear publication pathways. So we did the admissions anthology, which Cedar would know about, and that was with Upswell. I got some. I personally got some funding to put that together with Muhammad Arwood and Radia Chowdhury, and we got as many voices in as we can. Like it's a really thick book. Like we were told there's too many, but we got as many voices in as we could into that, and that was really well received. And people say you're going to do another version, and it's like putting anthologies together a huge amount of work, and a lot of big presses nearly took admissions on, and then balked at the last minute at how to market a lived experience anthology. So I still think there's a long way to go. And thank goodness for Terry Ann and Upswell saying absolutely. Um, but yeah, my agent Alex Adset really tried to sell that to every publisher, and it got close, but there was always that hesitation, even though there's big public names talking about mental health experiences. So I do feel like we're still at a place where I get sent a lot of lived experience manuscripts, and I think that publishers need there's a lot of work and care that needs to happen if you're going to do that. And I think a lot of publishers balk at that. But at the same time, Cedar, send it to the likes of, Upswell, send it to UQP, send it to these places. Because I think there's a hunger to read more of that.
Thank you. Megan asks, what are the pros and cons to putting your poetry on social media? And does it count as being previously published, i.e., will it prevent more traditional publishers from considering it for publication?
So what was the first part of that question?
Pros and cons of putting your poetry on social
Pros and cons.
media.
Again, I think everyone would have a different take depending who you asked in the industry about this. I don't really see a lot of cons. I mean, I used to use Facebook I would write free form first drafts on there. And I would use it a first draft space, and I would just actually be writing the first draft, if it was that kind of piece, as a sort of first draft dump, and then people would sort of sometimes respond and make suggestions, and then I would take it away and then work on it. So I don't do that anymore, but it was an interesting process. It was kind of thrilling and felt risky and felt like, um, I was in real time, sort of like writing a first draft. So that was interesting. I think people sharing poetry on particularly spaces like Instagram, it gives a sort of sense of connectivity, a sense of voice, a sense of what an artist is trying to do. And I think there's any real cons on that. It is true that a lot of competitions and a lot of journals don't accept, if you look at their guidelines, don't accept poems if they've been published previously on people's social media channels or blogs. But I'm seeing a few more journals not be so strict on that, saying, that's okay. So my suggestion would be, if you're going to submit a poem to a journal, check their guidelines, and if it's there, just pull it off. Just make that post private for now while you've got that in as a submission.
Right. Okay. Jennifer asks, does Red Room have an attitude or a take on reviewing in the more traditional sense, for example, ABR, or are they rethinking it?
Is that Jennifer Compton?
I don't know.
I bet it is. If it is Jennifer Compton, one of our great poets and amazing reviewer. No, I don't think that's really a central tenet to Red Room. I think one of the keys we want to do is not kind of replicate what other orgs are already doing. Like, we're not a festival, we're not a journal. We have elements of those things, but it is more kind of channeled towards clear, clearly structured projects with clear kind of directions and communities we're trying to reach. I think reviewing a poetry in this country is, it's very hard to get books reviewed. I can say that personally as well. It's very hard to get books reviewed, and my publisher will talk about that in the major newspapers. In fact, I know like the Australian doesn't have a poetry reviewer. Well, that's what I've been told at the moment. So there's a lot of pressure on like Sydney Review of Books and Australian Book Review, and Meandrin does do some stuff online. Cordite's amazing for that. But yeah, the channels are limited with more books coming out. And the importance of reviews, yeah, they're still kind of a central part of that poetry landscape you talk about, to help kind of get the word out, to help get an awareness. So I do feel like that is a bit of a gap currently. We don't have I'd love to see more poetry viewing come back to national art stages at a different level, and maybe yeah, see more kind of like high profile online poetry reviewing sites outside those ones I just named. Yeah.
Right. Anthea asks, what inspired you to transition from psychology to poetry? And how do you feel you draw from your knowledge outside of writing, inspiring and adding to your voice and uniqueness?
That's a nice question. Um, well, I'd always loved poetry. I worked as a psych for 10 years, predominantly in drug and alcohol, um, mental health, and particularly gambling addiction in often rural and regional settings, quite isolated. And I ended up having quite a significant mental health episode. Ended up on the other side of the couch. Not that I ever had a couch, that's such a cliche. And through that was, assessed as not being able to work as a psych anymore. And during that period, I was doing a community radio show and started to return the idea of poetry and started a local open mic in the Noosa hinterland where I was living. And from that, started getting invited to schools, and I think, and then things grew from there, and I was really clear that's my passion, and even if I was ever well enough, but it has been a real intersection point in that, I do have skills to, and a relatability to a lot of experiences in mental health settings, from both sides of that, and an awareness of the care that's needed to set up things like a mad poetry space where we're working with vulnerable people, including the facilitators, and there's a lot of responsibility. It's not just a straight, writing group on a Wednesday with aspirational writers. So I'm able to draw on a lot of those experiences and skills to ensure those spaces are set up properly. And it's right through my work, like case notes, which you mentioned at the beginning. There's a long poem there that documents my experience with ECT, and it really interrogates, like, particularly language, the use of language, dehumanizing language and reclaiming language in the mental health system. So I think the way language is used in bureaucratic and institutional settings, poetry is a great art form to then kind of really, interrogate that and take it to new places and sort of pull it apart, to see sort of the absurdity, and then through doing that, destigmatize it and reclaim it.
We also had a question about performance poetry, which came from Anna on our team. So she's asked, when performance poetry is enjoyed live, part of its power seems to exist in its impermanence. What do you think happens to the traditionally ephemeral form of performance poetry when it is immortalized online?
I think it's brilliant. I think it's brilliant. I mean, I love seeing, I can see there's Daphne's in this call, and Daphne runs Westside Poetry Slam. Great. These community slams are so important, and as part, I've seen, so yeah, going to like the Australian Poetry Slam final, or going to a community-based slam, or going to Bankstown Poetry Slam. There's nothing like it, and it's like sometimes when you listen to a poem and you don't really care what's being said, it's the sound time that or the wordplay on the page matters. Sometimes at a live poetry gig, I don't even remember the poems. I just remember the immersive experience of being there when that poem occurred, or the movement. I mean, for me, poetry is a full body experience, even when you're writing it. And I think that is best represented on stage. But I think if you watch, like I said, United States of Poetry, they're all video poems, video performance poems, and it changed. It's one of my favorite body of work, poetic bodies of work. When we did Contain Strong Language, we booked programmed a lot of spoken word performance artists from Western Sydney, First Nations artists, hip hop artists like Dobby. That was all recorded for audio on the BBC and has been incredibly well received. Now, those audiences weren't there, but they're listening to the live audio, which you can listen to on repeat. Also, the ability to return to a performance that thrilled you and then spend time with the actual work at a different level. That opportunity is amazing. So, and video poems we do through commissions are some of our, we've got a piece by the comedian that's what I reckon, which is all about the lockdown laws in Sydney, which is being one of our most viewed videos. So I don't think you lose anything. I think you actually gain something when there's a next stage to return to. And the other thing I mentioned a couple of years ago, I co-edited, you mentioned this as well, Solid Air. Australia, New Zealand spoken word, we were told, you can't have a spoken word anthology. Yes, you can. You can curate spoken word on the page. Absolutely. And I still stand by that as one of the best anthologies in Australia today, even though a lot of those poets, it was first publication or they didn't have a book out before.
So you've got so much going on, David, and there's a lot of love for Red Room in the room. If people would like to support Red Room, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, you can. There's a number of ways. I mean, we are very fortunate to have, org funding with Creative Australia and Create New South Wales and some key supporters. But the scope of our programming and what we deliver with our team and the size of these projects, we're always looking for support. I know it's a really tough time for that, but you can donate. You can go to our about page or Red Room Poetry. Um, and you'll see a donate page where you can contribute, which goes into, paying poets, directly commissioning new voices. But other ways you can support, which is really important, is read the poetry. Follow us on our social channels. Go and read one of our commissions. Go and read about Briar Beret or Poem Forest. That really matters. People engaging with the projects digitally. Go and check out our archive. You can read Claire, our amazing operation managers, Claire Albrecht, has now got thematics built in. So you can just look up, bureaucracy, nature, love, and a bunch of poems in the archive will come up thematically around that. I think that's really exciting because I think thematics matter to a lot of people when they're trying to look through a big thing of like, how do I just sort of get a through line with this work? And the last thing I'd say is, yeah, come along to our, engage with our online call outs and competitions and come along to our live events and online events because audiences really matter. When we're partnering with big orgs and we're trying to keep doing major live events, having people there really matters and it helps ensure that they're ongoing outlets for live readings and performance.
Wonderful. Well, that is all that we have time for today. But thank you so much, David, for sharing your time and expertise with us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. If you aren't already, make sure that you are subscribed to our weekly e-newsletter, Newsbite, for information on all of our upcoming events and the links to RSVP for future First Fridays. But thank you for joining us and hope to see you again soon. And again, thanks very much, David.
Thanks for having me and make sure you support Writing New South Wales. Writing centres, they're really key when we talk about the literary landscape. So thanks so much to get a chance to talk about my work and Red Room.
Thank you.